Our story begins in 1992. Warner Brothers and DC have just released Tim Burton's Batman Returns. It's dark, it's violent, and it's got Tim Burton's signature goth style. The day it was released, parents accused the movie of being too dark for their young children, and complained that the film had falsely advertised itself to children by selling McDonald's Happy Meals. Parents were writing angry letters to a movie studio over Happy Meals, so basically, Karens were a thing in the 90s. After the backlash, DC and Warner Brothers made a choice that would define the future of DC movies. They decided to abandon Tim Burton and hire Joel Schumacher to make 2 more Batman movies that were essentially designed to sell toys to little kids. Basically, Batman went from this to this.
All right, everyone, chill.
Fast forward a couple decades and Batman is now cool again thanks to Christopher Nolan. In July 2008, DC releases The Dark Knight, and it becomes not only one of the best superhero movies ever made, but one of the best movies ever made. But 2 months before that, something more interesting happened. In May, Marvel released Iron Man, and with it the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it began. Marvel quickly developed a formula for success. Tell a lighthearted story with a mildly funny joke every 5 minutes, sell some toys, and make a whole lot of money. DC started to become irrelevant. And once that happened, they were faced with the same choice they were faced with in 1992. In door number 1, make dark movies that give artistic control fully to the director. In door number 2, make lighthearted movies that sell toys where the artistic control resides in the studio, not the director. And that's how we got 2011's Green Lantern, starring Ryan Reynolds. Green Lantern immediately became a commercial and critical hit, allowing DC to launch a cinematic universe far better and more successful than Marvel's. And to this day, Green Lantern is one of the best superhero movies ever made. Needless to say, Green Lantern was a disaster. So DC steps back and picks door number 1, and they decide to call up Zack Snyder. And with that, we get Man of Steel in 2013, the movie where Superman is dark and brooding and snaps a guy's neck at the end. And that's followed up in 2016 by Batman v Superman. I think it's safe to say that before The Last Jedi came out, Batman v Superman was probably the most controversial movie ever. It was dark and gritty, and it wasn't for everyone. But more importantly, it wasn't trying to be for everyone. And it was definitely a product of Zack Snyder's personal artistic vision. It was everything that Marvel movies are not. And so far in this video, I've mostly been talking about DC's history without really bringing up my personal opinions. But I have to say, when I first saw Batman v Superman, I absolutely Oh my gosh! Hey! It's been forever, how have you been? I mean, I saw you a couple months ago and a few times last year, but yeah, it's been a while since we really talked. But yeah, I'm doing good. I'm in a solid relationship. And okay, it might not be as exciting as what we had, but at least it's stable. And I mean, come on, it had to end. I stuck with you through some rough times, but when Justice League came out, I knew it was over. And yeah, we had some good times, but I mean, it was 2016, and I was a pretentious movie nerd who was getting tired of Marvel, and I grew up reading DC Comics, and my favorite movie was The Dark Knight. So yeah, when you released a dark, gritty superhero movie, of course I was going to fall in love. You know, I actually rewatched Batman v Superman recently, and now that it's all behind us, it was okay. There's still a lot that I like about it, but I mean, let's be honest, the character motivations could have been a lot better. But I guess sometimes I miss those days when it felt like it was just you and me against all the haters in Marvel movies. But then you started to change. And I think that's when it all fell apart. After Batman v Superman became a commercial and critical failure, Warner Brothers turned their attention to their next DC film, Suicide Squad. And once again, they're faced with the same choice they were faced with in 1992. You see, Suicide Squad had a whole lot of behind-the-scenes drama. But the TLDR is that the production was super rushed, they ended up doing a whole lot of reshoots, and Warner Brothers hired 2 different editors to create 2 different final cuts of the movie. One cut was more lighthearted and funny, while the other cut was darker and more serious. Door number 1 and door number 2. So, which door did DC pick this time? Well, neither. Instead of just choosing one cut of the movie, they ended up awkwardly meshing them together, which is why the movie doesn't have a consistent tone and just kind of feels like a mess. I mean, Green Lantern was a terrible movie, but at the very least, it was consistent. Fast forward a year and Zack Snyder is still under contract to make Justice League. It's set to be another dark, gritty Zack Snyder movie until Snyder's daughter tragically passes away in March 2017. And to replace him, Warner Brothers hires Joss Whedon, the guy who did the first 2 Avengers movies. They went from the guy who did this,
You were never a god. You were never even a man.
to the guy who did this.
Alright, hey. Alright, good job, guys. You ever tried shawarma?
Somehow DC made a movie that felt even more inconsistent and messy than Suicide Squad. I mean, half of the movie is saturated slow-mo shots of people being sad, and the other half of the movie is...
I believe in truth. But I'm also a big fan of justice.
What this told us was that DC still couldn't pick a door. Marvel established a specific tone and narrative style and stuck with it through all of their movies. Meanwhile, DC couldn't even keep a consistent tone within one movie. And so what should have been a huge hit ended up being DC's biggest flop. So what do? Well, they just lost millions of dollars while Marvel has been consistently raking in the big bucks, so sounds like they should just do whatever Marvel has been doing. It's time to pick door number 2. And so in December 2018, we get Aquaman, followed in March of 2019 by Shazam. Both are lighthearted, funny, got strong reviews, and Aquaman is currently DC's highest grossing movie ever. We currently live in a world where Aquaman made nearly twice as much money as Justice League. Just let that sink in. So it sounds like DC finally found a way to make movies that get decent reviews and make money. So why does it still feel like something's missing? Look, you have to understand that I never left because you were too dark, or because you weren't like Marvel. I left because you kept trying to be like Marvel. And with Aquaman and Shazam, I guess you finally succeeded. You made 2 Marvel movies that just happened to be about characters from DC Comics. But I never wanted you to make Marvel movies. We already have more than enough Marvel movies. I wanted you to be something different. I guess I just missed the days when you weren't afraid to be ambitious and dark and edgy. And I already know what you're gonna say, which is that you learned that lesson. And I have to say, you really surprised me. Last October, DC released Joker, and suddenly everything changed. You see, with Aquaman and Shazam, DC had figured out that they could make successful movies just by copying the Marvel formula. And yet they still decided to make an R-rated psychological thriller. It's dark and disturbing and even hard to watch at times, but most importantly, it's everything that Marvel isn't. Throughout this video, I've been talking about the two doors that DC has been faced with for the past decade, trying to be the opposite of Marvel and trying to be just like Marvel. But Joker doesn't really take either of those doors. Now yes, it is a very dark movie, but not in the same way that Man of Steel and Batman v Superman are dark. You see, with those movies, it felt like DC was being dark just for the sake of being different than Marvel. I mean, if Marvel had never existed, do you really think that DC would have made a movie where Superman snaps a guy's neck? So what if this whole time there was a third door, which is to just make good movies and not care about Marvel? And the best way for DC to do that is for them to understand their strengths. You see, DC can do things that Marvel can't do, and if they want to stay relevant, they have to make the most out of that. That's why even though Aquaman and Shazam did well, they didn't stand out. They aren't memorable the way that Joker is. And that's because Joker does everything that Marvel isn't capable of. Joker is an R-rated psychological thriller whose main character has serious mental health issues. Joker also wasn't a part of any cinematic universe. Now don't get me wrong, cinematic universes totally have their benefits, but that also comes with limitations. Every Marvel movie has to fit the same general tone of all the previous Marvel movies, and they also have to logically fit within the overall story. One aspect of Joker's story is that Bruce Wayne is a young child, even though Joker is an adult. But if DC was trying to make Joker fit within a cinematic universe that already had a Batman, I don't think we could have gotten that young Bruce Wayne character. So that would have placed a limitation on the story they were trying to tell. Last but certainly not least, Joker feels like the product of an artistic vision. That's something that we really don't get with Marvel movies. When I watch Ant-Man, I don't feel like I'm watching a Peyton Reed movie. When I watch Doctor Strange, I don't feel like I'm watching a Scott Derrickson movie. I just feel like I'm watching a Marvel movie. That's because Marvel always has more creative control than their directors, so that they can ensure that the movie they're making will fit the Marvel brand. In an interview, Joker director Todd Phillips said, "You can't beat Marvel. It's a giant behemoth. So let's do something they can't do." This is a lesson that carried over into DC's latest film, Birds of Prey. Birds of Prey isn't really a dark movie, but it also drops the F-bomb over 80 times and features Ewan McGregor cutting people's faces off, so it's definitely not a Marvel movie. And if you're very observant, you'll have noticed that there's one major DC movie that I haven't mentioned in this video yet: Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is another film that isn't really dark in its tone, but it doesn't feel like a Marvel movie either. And that's because Wonder Woman was just trying to be a good movie, rather than trying to be just like Marvel or the opposite of Marvel. But in a weird way, I'm kind of glad that DC spent a few years making bad movies. I mean, it sucks that they ruined some of the heroes I grew up loving, but all of that failure is what allowed them to start taking risks. Marvel doesn't take risks. I mean, after all, if you have a formula that can consistently make you hundreds of millions of dollars, why would you do anything different? But that's why Marvel movies will always be stuck in a state of being pretty good. Because when a studio takes risks, that's when we get movies that can change the way we think about the superhero genre. We get movies that are innovative and memorable and daring. And that kind of risk could only come from the depths of DC's failure. So Is Justice League a cringeworthy mess that did a terrible job of using CGI to remove Henry Cavill's mustache? Absolutely. But you know what? That stupid CGI mustache is how DC got their groove back. I guess Joker just reminded me of all the good times we had. It reminded me of when you were ambitious and edgy, and I just saw you being yourself for the first time in years. And that's all I ever wanted from you. And it made me realize that maybe I am a bit tired of Marvel movies. So, I mean, if you'd want to get a cup of coffee sometime, you know where to find me.